Chapter 2. By coach from Cripplegate. Distant, urgent voices echoed as they left Seething Lane, and a great pall of smoke rose in the west. London was accustomed to fires, its buildings being largely wooden. As far back as the 12th century, city elders had decreed that dwellings should be built from stone to prevent fires, yet citizens ignored this and chose the cheaper timber option. Strong winds fanned the flames towards the city's heart and down to the Thames, where warehouses burned and the intense heat ignited oils, alcohol, and tallow stored inside. The heat grew so fierce that pigeons began falling from the sky. London Bridge itself was on fire. Fortuitously, a large gap between its buildings halted the fire's spread, sparing the south bank of the river. While Jacob and Abigail rushed on foot towards their appointed carriage, Samuel Pepys climbed the Tower of London for a better view of the fire. Suitably concerned, he then hurried by water to Whitehall to warn King Charles II himself, whom he had come to know through his work for the Navy. London was burning. Witnessing the unfolding devastation at first hand, the inquisitors agreed to travel east, following the curve of London Wall to their destination of Cripplegate. It would ensure maximum distance between themselves and the conflagration. Jacob bemoaned having no time to return home to collect supplies for their trip. The shirt on his back he'd already worn for several days. Abigail suggested he be grateful to live so far from the travelling flames. Standish resided in affluent Westminster, outside the city boundary. Having followed Hart Street, the inquisitors reached Aldgate, the city's easternmost gate. London's wall had been built by the Romans to enclose the ancient city of Londinium. Over the centuries, it had been expanded and rebuilt. Within its walls lay bustling commerce. Beyond them, green fields and grazing animals, driven down from as far as Wales and Scotland, being fattened for market. Aldgate itself, like all of London's great gates into and out of the city, was set within the wall. An imposing stone structure with towers on either side of an arch, it was wide enough to allow the passage of coaches and carts. London citizens were out in force. Market stalls sold everything from turnips to tools, and the smells of baking bread and cooking filled the air. A hackney coach stand near the gate thronged with drivers tending their horses while awaiting their fares. "I walked quite enough last night," said Jacob, climbing inside one. "Today we take a carriage." Abigail, whose shilling a week wage meant she walked everywhere, was happy to agree. Time was running short. They had just an hour to catch the 10 o'clock stagecoach to Huntingdon. Following the curve of London Wall westwards, Abigail and Jacob passed Bishopsgate and Moorgate, two of the city's northern gates, and the towering churches of St. Augustine, Pepys, and All Hallows. From the raised ground, they could see the burning spires of churches closer to the river. They could smell the smoke and hear the distant frantic cries of Londoners fighting the blaze or fleeing. If the wind direction did not change, Jacob feared, it would not be long before the financial district around Lombard Street, even the popular centre of commerce, the Royal Exchange at Cheapside, were reduced to rubble. The city, as he knew it, was disappearing. This was a disaster like no other. "How much of London will remain when we return?" Jacob wondered aloud. Abigail bit her lip. "I'm worried about Master Pepys' house. Will it survive?" Their coachman must have overheard as he called back. "Be one of them foreigners started it," he said. "Frenchman or Dutch, most likely." "Indeed," Jacob replied. Abigail, accustomed to such prejudice among her fellow Londoners, said nothing. Cripplegate was one of London's busiest gates, leading north towards the popular suburbs of Islington and Hoxton. The route eventually led to Chester, from where boats could be taken to Ireland. Its main arch featured an iron portcullis that could be raised and lowered in the event of attack. The structure boasted numerous windows and accommodation at the top. In one such room lived the powerful man who policed the Thames, London's water bailiff, who was also head of the worshipful company of fishmongers. Today, Cripplegate was busier than ever, with people fleeing the city for safety. They jostled and argued while traders, seemingly blithely untroubled, continued hawking their wares. "Is that our coach?" asked Abigail, indicating a large stagecoach just north of the gate with 4 large horses tethered in front. It turned out that it was. Their wooden enclosed coach had 2 large 8-spoked wheels at the back and 2 smaller ones at the front. Its body was painted functional red with black wheels, resembling a larger version of a hackney coach. There was no glass in the windows, only wooden shutters to keep out the elements. Although it looked heavy and ungainly, to Abigail, who'd never ridden a stagecoach, it also looked like adventure. Inside, there was room for 6 passengers. When Abigail stepped up onto the footplate, ushered there by Jacob, she found an old couple already inside, sitting opposite one another. They were arguing. "Why did you not bring a cushion for me, Humphrey?" the lady demanded. Humphrey winked at Abigail. "Since your derriere, Millicent, is padded enough." At which Millicent began assaulting her husband with a bag. When Jacob entered the carriage, cutting an imposing figure, the old woman ceased her assault in mid-air. Returning the bag to her lap, she coughed pointedly and wrinkled her nose. "Oh, dear," she said, eyeing the dishevelled inquisitor. "How unfortunate." The fellow travellers were Humphrey and Millicent Worthington, both in their early 60s. He was jolly and portly, with bushy grey nose hair that resembled a tiny moustache. He sweated profusely, despite the cold air that made their breath condense, and was constantly mopping his brow. He wore a velvet waistcoat with a watch chain overtly displayed and a feathered velvet hat, which he declined to remove. "Take off your hat, Humphrey." "I will not, Millicent." Again he winked at Abigail. "It keeps my head on." Millicent slapped his leg. "Stop winking at that poor girl. She has no interest in you." The long-suffering woman carried an air of faded elegance. Her silver hair was tied in a tight bun, and her delicately lined face tapered towards an upturned nose. Her cold lips were permanently pursed. Both wore outfits of style and elegance, if some years out of date. As the coach set off towards Stevenage, where they would lodge that night, Mr. Worthington bellowed, "I must tell you about the cloth trade." Though both inquisitors groaned inwardly, and that is precisely what he did. Until retiring in 1656, Humphrey told them he'd been a successful cloth merchant. He'd risen up the ranks to become master of the Worshipful Company of Clothworkers, one of the great 12 livery companies of London. These were the most powerful and influential trades companies in the city, holding great sway over daily life and business. He went on to explain the art of dyeing, the intricacies of wool grading, and the subtle variations in quality between the coats of different breeds of British sheep. He covered the finishing of cloth and the art of weaving. He detailed the processes of fulling, napping, shearing, and pressing. "Pray stop, Humphrey," implored his wife. Having considered Abigail and Jacob distinctly beneath her, she was beginning to feel sorry for them. Still, he went on. The banquets, the trade deals, the charitable work. It was an exhausting whirlwind of self-congratulation, and Abigail wondered whether they would ever be set free. At roughly 4 miles per hour, she calculated, it would be another day and a half before they reached Brampton. She dearly hoped the Worthingtons were not travelling that far. There was no escaping it. Humphrey Worthington, master of the Worshipful Company of Clothworkers, was king of the coach, and a right royal bore. Just outside Stevenage, as luck would have it, he was shot by a highwayman. The dirt road had worsened as they rode further from London, forcing the coachman to stop and repair a wheel damaged in a rut. That was when Humphrey's assailant struck, cantering towards them in a cloak and cocked hat, his face obscured by a white scarf. These renegade horseback robbers were a constant threat on the main routes out of London, and particularly on the Great North Road that Abigail and Jacob were following. These were men fallen on hard times, often soldiers unable to find work after the last English Civil War, desperate and dangerous. "Fill the bag," the highwayman growled, thrusting a flintlock pistol into Mrs. Worthington's face with one hand and a canvas sack into her husband's lap with the other. "Do something, Humphrey!" she shrieked. Jacob leapt up, forgetting the low roof, smacked his head, lost his balance, and fell backward against the door. It flew open, and he fell to the ground, where he lay, befuddled. Seizing his opportunity, Humphrey Worthington lunged for the highwayman's pistol, which discharged, firing a ball of lead harmlessly through the open door opposite. Abigail fancied she felt it disturb the air at the tip of her nose. "Now I have you, scoundrel!" cried Worthington, aware that flintlocks carried just the one shot. "You will hang for this!" The highwayman dropped his sack, drew a second pistol from his belt, pointed it at the retired cloth merchant, and fired. A burst of flame, a sharp report, a plume of smoke, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. Worthington fell backwards. "Oh, my!" gasped his wife. The scarf fell from his face, revealing a frightened lad, no older than 20, with a vivid scar running from his mouth to his ear. Panicked, he dropped the pistol, lunged for Worthington's pocket watch, and scarpered. At the King's Arms in Stevenage, servants rushed to carry a groaning Worthington from the carriage, while his flustered wife alternately fussed, wept, and mopped his brow. In truth, it was merely a flesh wound, but Humphrey Worthington was not one to eschew a grand entrance. Finally, after some 30 miles of tortuous journeying, the inquisitors were alone together. The sun had set and night was drawing in. Abby had never been so far from London in her life. "The air smells so different out here, so strangely clean," she thought. When she listened for the familiar city sounds, she heard only the wind in the trees and the cawing of a crow. The King's Arms was an impressively sized coaching inn, catering to many thousands of travellers the year around. Its timber frames, set horizontally, vertically, and diagonally, were painted black, and its wattle and door plastering whitewashed. Its windows, in pairs and threes, bore diamond-shaped leading, and the roofs were tiled in red brick. Outside hung a large sign depicting King Charles II's coat of arms. Not long ago, the inn had been called the Cromwell, the innkeeper having wisely changed allegiance. Inside were roaring fireplaces and revelry, smells of roasting meat, hops, pipe smoke, and bodily